So we have been hearing about swatting issues here in San Antonio for a few years now. Just for some context, how long have we been seeing swatting? How long have we been putting that name to it?
Yes, thank you. Well, unfortunately, this is something that has been around for about 2 decades. So the first time that it really entered the national consciousness was in 2008 when the Federal Bureau of Investigation released one of their notification memos to the wider law enforcement community. And they were reporting actually that from 2002 to about 2006, several individuals had called over 60 cities, creating this phenomenon. So it was really coined in 2008 as swatting, but it has been going on for about 20 years.
We have seen a lot of schools targeted here in swatting attempts. For the people that are doing this, what is the draw of a school to do something like this?
Well, in the research that I've done, it's been mostly on private individuals being affected, but that's actually the next stage of my research is looking at school-specific calls. And the aim of this is to create as much fear, either on an individual or social level as possible. And the aim of a school is that they're tapping into a lot of American society's well-known knowledge that this is a place where violence does happen. And so it becomes somewhat easier to trigger those associations by targeting a school, which is unfortunately in this country somewhat of a target for individuals like this. And of course, really violent individuals in real life.
From law enforcement agencies here in San Antonio and Bexar County, we've heard that sometimes these calls can come from private individuals, sometimes it's organizations, sometimes they're not even in the United States. Trend-wise, what are we seeing in terms of who is making these swatting calls?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, internationally, we do have a lot of individuals coming from what I've seen in my research. But this is something that unfortunately anyone that has access to a free online service can create a phone number and call in. So while we do have mostly the individuals that have been prosecuted are from here in the States, we do have quite a few coming from abroad, but I can't give you a definitive answer on that one just because that part of it is outside my expertise as a linguist.
That's okay. So when we look at swatting calls, how does law enforcement determine where they're coming from, especially if it is meant to be elusive?
Right. Well, I mean, most, communication centers in a 911 have the ability to geolocate where the call is coming from when a phone number is associated with an address, or if they have a specialized system to determine roughly what the coordinates are. One thing I do want to stress that in my research looking at these calls, even though I focus on the language, we've seen how technologically sophisticated they are, which means that because of these free online services, they're able to spoof or create a fake address of their actual target location. And this is something that we can't just use, unfortunately, relying by looking at, in that system itself and say, oh, the call center says it's at this address. I'm not sure that 911 call dispatchers can always trust that, unfortunately.
What does the process look like for law enforcement as they're trying to figure out where these calls are coming from?
Well, the fascinating thing is that these calls really follow the typical structure of a 911 call in terms of its organization. And as we've studied 911 calls and their language for about 40 years from linguistic perspectives, we found that there's a five-part structure to these calls where you've got the call opening, 911, what's your emergency? The caller then makes a request, which can be sometimes like a little story or just directly say, I need police, ambulance, fire. And then there's this question and answer period. And for 911 dispatchers, the most important information they can get is where is the location. And in our analysis, in every one of the swatting calls we looked at, they provided that location right off the bat, because for a swatter, that's their main priority is to get the police to a specific location. So unfortunately, when it comes to this part of the call, that's something that they can very quickly get. And then after that, question and answer sequence about the nature of the emergency, the 911 call takers will give a response, say, help is coming, help is on the way, and then there's a closing. And these swatting calls do typically follow that pattern, but there are some exceptions as we found in our own research.
What were some of those exceptions?
Well, this is the fascinating thing, and I got to bring my co-author into this, Jennifer Plum, who's a graduate of our program here at Hofstra. This project arose because she, before she was a Hofstra student, was actually swatted herself. And so this was a case of mistaken identity, she believes, but she had the full SWAT team show up to her and her family, her dogs, and everything were affected. But she was inspired to really do this research. And one thing that we found is that unlike a typical 911 call where a 911 dispatcher will work to sort of calm the person, try to mitigate their emotions in order to have a successful call, one thing that these swatters will do in 12 of the 15 calls that we looked at, it was a small sample because we could only find publicly available audio, but we saw that in 12 of those calls, instead of kind of calming down in response to these moves, they would then escalate the emergency. So instead of like, if they're pretending to be a perpetrator, saying like, yeah, I'll wait for the police or something, they'll say, oh no, I'm going to shoot X, and that can be a girlfriend, a child, a vulnerable victim. There are other ways of doing this, however, such as threatening self-harm, referencing mental health, essentially kind of triggering the expectations of a call taker for someone that is unstable and would warrant a SWAT team response.
How does that research have the potential to help 911 dispatchers and police try to figure out what is swatting and what's not?
Thank you for bringing that up. And this is still an ongoing project. So as I mentioned, I'm looking at school swatting incidents in particular. But one thing I do want to caution against is using my research or other linguist research as a checklist, because when you kind of go down a list and say, this is a caller being truthful, this is a caller who's a swatter, that means that unfortunately in real cases, you could not have a SWAT team sent. And so I think the biggest practical implications of our research is that law enforcement needs to, if they have a suspected swatting call, if you're a dispatcher, consider triangulating the information. As you solicit the information, try to get some info about what is the appearance of the location, kind of telling us something about their house so that the people on scene can verify if they actually are there and know what it's about. If it's something like a school, reaching out to school authorities, reaching out to the school law enforcement liaison, seeing if they've heard shots, because oftentimes these calls kind of come in the middle of the action. And like I said, they're technologically sophisticated, which includes playing recorded gunshots on the tape, which a dispatcher may not be able to distinguish as real or false. And so I think that kind of triangulation is part of it. Also trying to get as much sort of real world verifiable information as possible is key when trying to distinguish these calls. But at the same time, please don't take these linguistic figures as checklist of truthful or deceptive just because we don't want to give a binary distinction when this kind of real world stakes can happen.
Is there anything else that you would want to make sure people know about swatting and especially swatting when it comes to schools?
Yeah, so I was having a conversation with a friend of the family who worked on plane hijackings back in the 70s and 80s when those were so common. He's a psychologist, and even though I'm a linguist, I try not to get into people's heads because we just have the language. And he, in his opinion, mentioned this was sort of a form of social contagion, in that the more that people hear about swatting, unfortunately, the more bad actors will realize that this is something that can be a prank, not just a prank, but a criminal activity or a kind of social justice idea of targeting a politician they don't like. And so I think that what people need to realize is that if you are someone that could be in a potential swatting situation, have a couple of procedures in place for how can we trust but verify that a situation is happening. If there's a potential swatting, could we perhaps come up with a few designated numbers that the police could then call and say, hey, we've had a call come in from a parent or from a student or from multiple students. Can you verify what's going on? And so I think that that might be one way to mitigate this. Several states have made this a misdemeanor, but it's part of that kind of big umbrella of laws of making a false police report or calling 911 and lying on a 911 call. So it could be that maybe deterrence will go through the legal methods, but I think that what people should know is just that, unfortunately, swatting is something that is easy to do, and we just need to prepare ourselves as a society to deal with this contagion until it eventually will go away through our efforts of